And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Nkem, is an assistant professor of African diaspora archaeology at the University of Toronto. Um, she's worked on a lot of really cool projects in my mind in terms of bringing some hidden histories to the present and showing us some things that may have been intentionally forgotten over the years. And I am excited to hear her talk tonight and look forward to it. It is Black History Month, and her talk seems very appropriate for this evening. And I want you to all help me welcome Enkim for this evening.
Thank you. It's nice to be with everybody. This is the first time in a long time that I've had the chance to present on my own work. And so I'm a bit nervous and a bit excited, but I'm sure we'll get through this together. Okay. So I want to start off with um, this image right here. So this image was taken by myself whenever I was working on the Mapping Historical Trauma Archaeology project in Tulsa. Um, and this was at the beginning of our field season. It was this image right here is a plaque, and it's a flowers, which we can all see, have been sort of uh, intentionally placed around the plaque. You can't really see what the plaque says, but it's an acknowledgement of what that land has seen and what it's endured. And the location is Standpipe Hill. And the reason why Standpipe Hill is sort of important to how the race massacre is sort of remembered and articulated is because when in the summer of 1921, when the massacre broke out, it is the location where um, white rioters emplaced guns to shoot at Black people as they were trying to leave um, Greenwood. And so that was Standpipe Hill is one location where we did a bit of archaeology there. And so I want to first kind of set the tone of this presentation. With that, and what's important to remember about this image right here is that although that's the sort of like legacy and like why we even went to Standpipe Hill, and why we did archaeology there, this image itself was taken during the centennial and in 2021. And it was on that day that we started our archaeology project. And whenever we started it, we saw these roses there. And these roses were sort of donated by this these sisters who were florists out of Oklahoma City. And like it's a really interesting way to think about like the how we remember the race massacre and how we remember this land, but also like how we can place beauty even on sites of extreme violence. And so I want to set the tone of this presentation by um, sort of thinking about and talking about when I started this project. And whenever I started this project, I thought it was just something that I do and get it over with and like finish my PhD and kind of like move on. I didn't realize the emotional toll that this project would take on me and how it would work on me. I found myself as I worked on this research as someone who's born and raised in Tulsa, in a constant state of grief and isolation, given the violence that I was inundated with. With this said, I found it important to learn how to move through this violence and not just sit in it. And I found it important to find a framework that can get at the complexities of Black life in the past and the present so that the future can be imagined. So a way to engage with Black people and the conditions, it became a way to engage with Black people and um, the conditions of Black life that sort of transcend time, space, and materiality to tell more complete and complex stories. So for us, we can think about the strategic, intentional, and systemic ways that violent histories are hidden. We can be honest and open about how we as archaeologists struggle with how to navigate histories and how it impacts our work, the communities we serve, and ourselves. We can bear witness to the spark that ignites Black life and lifeways. And I found that when dealing with violence, taking conventional archaeological approaches that are like much more rooted in these ideas of unbiased and rationality to be incompatible with not only me as a person, but also my archaeological practice. And so by pushing back against this notion, we're able to contend with our own discomfort and alienation that comes with being in a discipline that forces, privileges, and rewards frameworks predicated on neutrality, notions of being unbiased, and prioritizes rationality and reasoning. And that's really important because race massacres are highly emotionally charged events. And in their very essence, they defy reason and rationality because at their center is anti-Blackness, and there's nothing natural about anti-Blackness. And so this is something that I want us to think about as we like move through this um, presentation together. So how did I come to this project? As someone who's from Tulsa, I never thought that I'd be able to study my own community. And this opportunity didn't really come up until the second semester of my PhD program at the University of Tulsa. And the chair of my dissertation, or my advisor, Alicia Odewale, asked me if I wanted to be the graduate student on her project mapping historical trauma in Tulsa from 1921 to 2021. And her project was to explore the historic Greenwood district in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma, the site of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. What's important to remember about Tulsa at this, well, prior to this, was as someone who grew up there, we never went downtown. You never saw, like, even seeing Black people, it was rare. And the Black community at that time was sort of relegated to the north side of town. And with that came sort of like local government and state government abandonment, right? You have food deserts, you have all of these things that are very much structural, but come to sort of circulate Black life. And when people would even ask, like, where are the Black people, right? People would usually say, oh, they're in North Tulsa. Um, and so before I even developed any real consciousness around this topic, I didn't understand that what we were experiencing and seeing in Tulsa and the segregation that we were seeing and experiencing in Tulsa was through these systemic efforts, was the result of these systemic efforts of displacement. And that's why Black people were sort of relegated to this part of to the north part, to the north side of town. So fundamentally, just shows how the color line is maintained and sustained. And even whenever it's in flex, it's like it's meant to go fundamentally unchallenged and unquestioned. And so at the same time, it's important to remember that everyone in Tulsa can tell you the first time they heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And that has this sort of like profound impact on the sacredness of the historic Greenwood District, the massacre, and the legacy itself. And I came to understand by engaging more deeply with not only Tulsa, but the other sites under the purview of my research in Springfield and Rosewood, that when you've been kept away from your history for so long, when you finally come to know it, and by know it, I don't merely mean just like having knowledge of it, right? What I'm talking about is to know the facets and the contours and the flavors of it. You become changed and it becomes something that needs protecting. So when we ask ourselves, how do we excavate the demons of white supremacy, racism, colonialism, like all of these things, so that we can move through violence, it becomes necessary to acknowledge that we have to excavate those things so that we can move through violence and animate Black aliveness. And by Black aliveness, I mean these connections to place, to belonging, and to imagination that people have always fought for. And I want to point out these images too. I won't go through like every image in this presentation, but I do want to point out these images because they are during Juneteenth. Well, it's supposed to be during Juneteenth, but it's when Donald Trump came to Tulsa during the height of the pandemic. And these are some of the protests that resulted in the Trump administration, you know, being there and during that highly political time. So my current research looks at race massacres in three locations. The first one is Springfield, Illinois in 1908. The second one is Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. And the third one is Rosewood, Florida in 1923. And I choose these sites because it's where archaeology had been conducted. They represent only a sample of race massacres across the US, which you can see. The map here, this map shows that there are, in fact, 180 sites of racial violence between 1900 and 1935. Uh, and this sort of pushes back against, and I located these sites using archival materials like newspaper articles and stuff like that from the time period. And it was necessary to push back against the idea that of Cameron McWharton's book, which is famous and it's great. Like I love it. I use it as a resource and it's very important that he's sort of documenting the Red Summer, which took place in 1919, the summer of 1919, where he's sort of documenting 25 anti-Black race massacres that took place across the country. And so this map, the aim is to make visible the ever-present nature of racial violence, and in doing so, it confronts the idea that anti-Blackness is solely a Southern problem, which is something that has kind of withstood the test of time in the United States, um, and not a defining modality through which the United States was based on. And so by this, I'm framing race massacres as a part of what Hartman sort of talks about as like the afterlives of slavery. And so I examine how violence with these three different sites, and with this context in mind, I examine how violence informs the Black sense of place and how race massacres disarticulate descendant communities from the landscapes. Through this work, I explore how over time the impacts of racial violence continue to play out as Black descendants and stakeholders push back against the erasure enacted through the afterlives of these massacres to reassert their collective presence on the landscape through a critical engagement with the materiality of violence. And by the materiality of violence, I mean I'm d- I'm engaging with three forms of material culture: artifacts, which are objects that have been excavated, found, or heirlooms; memorialization, and by memorialization I mean place names, public art, statues, commemorative events, and archival remains, and the locations of their repositories, so photographs, documentation, historic maps, those sorts of things. And so these acts of violence laid the groundwork that fundamentally altered the landscape and therefore Black people's relationship to place, highlighting that the materiality of racial violence can exemplify larger cultural practices whereby the memory of these histories is maintained and assailed. I consider memorials, archives, and artifacts as vital to remembering and reckoning with the past and contemporary spatial violence. And when considered together, they also have the capacity to visualize individual historical violence in Springfield, Tulsa, and Rosewood, while simultaneously putting them into a larger national context of early 20th century racial violence. And so, unlike approaches conceptualizing such processes regarding dominations and subjugation, like the sort of dynamics of domination and subjugation, I'm interested in emphasizing aliveness as a site of liberatory struggle. And so these points inform how I arrive at doing this work and why the questions I found necessary to ask were important. And so the research questions that I developed are rooted in wanting to understand not only how materiality impacts the construction of place and Black memory, but also how that illuminates liberatory practices that disrupts narratives rooted in anti-Blackness. So the research questions that I developed are in the aftermath of early 20th century anti-Black race massacres. How did early Black communities in the United States survive and reclaim space for themselves? And how has each contemporary Black community created a unique Black identity that incorporates but is not limited to histories of mass racial violence? And so here I argue that it is through the power of placemaking and of placekeeping that these questions can be answered. And at the beginning of this project, I asked that, or I argued that the more access, or I was thinking, whenever I was thinking through this project and thinking about it, I was thinking that the more access to the materiality of racial violence that I described earlier a community had, the better their capacity for placekeeping would be. And I situate the materiality of racial violence in a Black feminist archaeological theoretical lens, and I developed a methodological approach whereby geographic information systems is at the heart of a Black geographies framework, which I call my Black geographies methodology. So, what's placekeeping? Placekeeping comes from the work of Black feminist and urban planner Andrea Roberts. And the strategies deployed, what she's talking about here are the strategies deployed by Black communities to keep the material remains of Blackness not necessarily on the landscape, but in public discourse through community channels that make secure their spatial and temporal longevity. Therefore, the ways in which communities use the material world and their physical environment to create a sense of place and identity and belonging is what she's trying to get at. And there are ways that getting to like the terms, and I think this is important to get at the differences between like a race riot and a race massacre and how it has historically been used and how it is used in the contemporarily and also how it's different amongst the three communities. So, what's the difference between a race riot and a race massacre? And that depends on how like they kind of historically function and what they're doing in the present. So race riot imply it's used to implicate Black people in the violence. And so in essence, it's arguing that the events that started the riot started because Black people weren't following some sort of like social rule. And so this is white people's attempts to correct that, right? But really, the onus and the responsibility is on Black people, and the implication is that like it's Black people destroying their own neighborhoods. And so that term in and of itself kind of implies that Black people are inherent perpetrators of violence and destruction, right? And Black people represent sort of like this stain on the wider community that needs to be like wiped out, right? So there are all of these like implications for it. Race massacres is this attempt to make culpable white people. And it highlights how every aspect of society, from law enforcement to the judicial system to media to everyday individuals, governments, were all involved in the destruction of Black people and property. And so we're talking about the systemic nature of violence in these cases. In the present, those distinctions are a bit complicated, particularly when thinking about these three sites. So riot is still used in Springfield and Rosewood. It is not used in Tulsa like at all. In Rosewood in particular, I remember I was talking to a scholar who was the head of the Rosewood Race Riot Commission in the early 90s. And we were in her office and we were talking. And I was using the term massacre and she was using the term riot. And then she, like at a certain point, stopped me and goes, "We don't use the term massacre down here because only 8 people died. And whenever we talk about these things, we want people to take us serious." Right. And I said, okay. In Tulsa, you don't use the term riot. And the reason why is because after the massacre, um, the term riot was sort of working in the way that it has historically been used to work, right? And so the implication was that these were just like Black folks destroying their own community, and insurance companies refused to pay out and to refuse to pay them back. And so that very act, that very term, and the acts that followed were the result of Greenwood, of it being like a bit of it being hard for Greenwood to rebuild after the massacre. And so Black folks don't use that term, and Tulsans don't use that term to describe what's the massacre because it's part of the erasure, the erasing of the community and of the visibility and of the impact. So, what's Black feminist archaeology? Black feminist archaeology was a theoretical approach first brought into the archaeological discipline by Black archaeologist Maria Franklin. It was the ideal framework for this research due to the ways in which Black feminism in and of itself highlights the intersectional nature of Black power, given its entanglement with the realities of anti-Black violence. And I argue that this approach helps us think through ways materiality can kind of get caught up in the past and contemporary social political dynamics and influence Black people's ability to engage with the tangibility of violence and articulate resistance to that violence. Also, it forces us to acknowledge the political underpinning of the archaeological discipline. Black feminist archaeologist Whitney Battle Baptiste argues that feminism, as a recognized aspect of archaeology, translates into an inherently political field that often has an that often has a direct impact on the communities we are attempting to serve and communicate with. And so, what's Black geographies? I've adopted Black geographies from geographer Catherine McKittrick, whose articulation of what it is, what she describes it as space, place, and locations in their physical materiality and imaginative configurations, which allow us to engage with narratives that locates and draws on Black histories and Black subjects in order to make visible social lives, which are often displaced and rendered ungeographic. She goes on to say that it is the procedure of collecting, assembling, and evaluating and an articulation of Blackness that confronts the dehumanization of Black people. This method is not meant to prove that race massacres took place, although it can very much function as that, right? Um, as much as it is to animate the ways in which Black placekeeping illuminates Black life. And so how they kind of work together. I employed this theory and methodological approach onto Springfield, Tulsa, and Rosewood to show that Blackness is capacious, ever present in the material world, and even when it doesn't appear in conventional ways. And together, they can expose the power play of concealed forms of violence and resisting by making the complexities of Black placekeeping apparent and transparent. So we're going to get into the communities. I want to preface this part, well, mainly like the materials. I want to preface this part by saying that I can't go over every piece of material. And so this is kind of just like a really quick and dirty like overview of the like why these communities are important, because that's something that we have to talk about as well. And it's something that kind of gets lost in these larger conversations. I think on local levels, it's very much like, of course, descendants and local communities understand why these historic communities are important, but that oftentimes isn't placed into national conversations, which then don't allow us to kind of talk to each other. And so I want to start off with that and also say that like these are just sort of like nuggets into certain materials. It's not every material that we find at each of these sites, which we will get into a bit more later. So all that to say. But Springfield, Illinois, it why is it famous, right? It's famous because of for a long time, and even still up until today. It's famous because it is where Abraham Lincoln, or, like the great emancipator, got his political start. Um, it's something that Springfield has leaned on. He's buried there, right? It's something that they're very proud of. It allowed Springfield to take on this sort of, what do you call it? Like, emancipatory, like wave this like the side of emancipatory flag, right? It allowed it to articulate itself as a sort of northern city with northern sensibilities, as being anti-racist, even before that was even kind of like a term, right? However, when the race massacre broke out in the summer of 1908, when white folks were kind of running Black folks out of Springfield, they were chanting, Lincoln freed you, and we're going to run you out of town. And it just shows how these two competing ideas about America can exist in the same place. And so the areas that were targeted were the Badlands and the Levee, which were located in East Springfield. And they're sort of referred to, the Levee in particular is kind of referred to as like the Black Belt. And it's where Black folks, it was sort of seen as the Black business district, and the Badlands was the residential district. Um, After the massacre took place there, it was so offensive to the country, right? Which was just coming, it was. at that point still like kind of trying to establish itself. And you have the sort of the first generation of folks who were born after enslavement, and it was kind of like offensive to the country, like how could this happen in the place where Abraham Lincoln got his political start? And so the result of it was um, the creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And as I kind of illuminated to before, it reframed racism in the United States as something that wasn't just a Southern problem. It was a national problem. And the idea that if this could happen in the place where, of Abraham Lincoln and the political birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, then it can happen anywhere, right? And it was a real indictment of the country during that time. And so the archaeology that kind of how archaeology started there was in 2013 when they were wanting to build this underpass project, and this firm, Fever River CRM firm, was hired to do the archaeology there. They discovered uh, the foundations of 5 dwellings that had been burnt down, destroyed during the massacre and in the Badlands. And the preservation of the materials was incredible because when the homes were burnt down and then eventually the land was bulldozed and, used for all of these other reasons, the materials were held up pretty well. And so you have these materials that are in pretty good condition. And you see this hatchet down here was something that helped that um, they were able to locate in the home of this woman named Bessie Black, who was a single woman living in the Badlands during that time. And then this memorial that you see up here is meant to look like it's in the city center of Springfield, in downtown Springfield. It's meant to look like these homes, this home that was destroyed where you only see the front and the back end. And it's meant to stand for it's kind of like resilience, right, amongst all of this chaos that you see in front of it and around it. Next, we have Tulsa, Oklahoma. So Tulsa's famous for being this like huge urban center, almost like a Harlem in the middle of the country, right? This cultural center with Blackness during the 1920s. It's also known for Black Wall Street. Um, and it was a large, successful, thriving community uh, after the massacre. And it was known for these reasons, right? For hospitality, the oil industry, entrepreneurs, professionals. All of that very much existed in Greenwood. After the massacre, though, which is part of the photo in the middle, which I'll get to in a second, you'll see that the massacre happened in the summer of 1921. Black community attempted to rebuild almost immediately. And there are elders who you'll talk to who'll tell you that Greenwood was bigger and better than ever in the 1930s, in the 1940s, in the 1950s, and there's a very strong and active Black community that's still present. And so then we're forced to kind of ask, okay, well then like what happened? So downtown Tulsa, Greenwood looks nothing like it did in the past, right? And so how did we get to the massacre, to the middle of the 20th century, Greenwood being bigger and better than ever, to then Greenwood no long to Greenwood looking like this picture right here at the very top, which is a plaque that the city has put along the street of Greenwood and Archer, which are the this really important intersection in what was the historic Greenwood district, and it was where like all the businesses were, right? And those businesses were effectively destroyed during the massacre. What this shows you is that it was destroyed in 1921, and Grace Johnson's restaurant on 621 East Archer didn't reopen, right? But many other businesses did reopen or start. And so that leads us to ask, well, then what's the point of these plaques, right? Like why aren't the businesses there? The reason why is because as what happened in the United States during the mid 20th century was the Federal Highway Project that was intentionally constructed to go through predominantly Black urban communities. And that's effectively in the 1960s and 1970s, when it finally got to Tulsa, that's effectively what killed the historic Greenwood district. So the archaeology projects that I had the pleasure to be a part of were the Mapping Historical Trauma in Tulsa project and the mass graves investigation. And in Mapping Historical Trauma, we conducted archaeology at three historic sites, Standpipe Hill, which we talked about at the beginning, uh, this this other place called the Stairways to Nowhere, which I'll talk about at the end. I know it's kind of like disjointed. And this other place called B.S. Roberts Park. Standpipe Hill, um, is sort of the most complete out of all three locations. And as of right now, we're able to document 150 artifacts. And this project came on the heels of the city of Tulsa's mass graves investigation, which had been a long time coming, and many descendants and survivors had pushed for this over time and sort of tried to push different mayors to to do this sort of project, right? And it kind of came to fruition in 19, not 19, in 2019, 2018, 2019. And so the goal of this project was to find what we call kind of like riot dead, which are in essence victims of the race massacre. And they started at Oaklawn Cemetery due to some historical documentations and narratives taken in the past of particularly a little white kid who said he saw them after the massacre. He saw men putting bodies of massacre victims in boxes and burying them until he was eventually kind of like shooed away and told to get out of there. So his name's Clyde Eddy. And so that's why they started at Oaklawn versus any other of the other sites that I'll show you later on in this presentation. And I was asked to participate in this project by the late Kevin Ross, who was a descendant of the race massacre and was the chair of the oversight committee. So last but not least is Rosewood. Significantly less is known about Rosewood, but what we do know is that Rosewood was an incorporated town, and according to archaeologist Edward Gonzalez Tennant, it had the highest rate of Black home ownership in the United States during that time. However, after the massacre in the winter of 1923, the community did not return. So today, the community is not present in Rosewood. However, descendants get together every year to remember the race massacre. Rosewood is also, which is something that I think is very powerful, right? It's also important to note that Rosewood, until honestly like a month ago, was the only like community of these three communities that got reparations in the early 90s. And so due to the losses of the massacre, right, of descendants, well, at the time survivors and then descendants of the massacre. And so the archaeology project directed by Dr. Marvin Dunn, uh, the archaeology project that sort of kicked off this was directed by Dr. Marvin Dunn of FIU, Florida International University. However, the artifacts are unavailable and the total objects are undetermined at this time. But the area that was excavated was a Masonic lodge in the railroad. Um, most of the materials that I was able to locate come from community members. And so this image right here is from community member Sherry Dupree, and she's holding a what she says is like a turpentine tool that someone was given to her. She also has a nail from the railroad. Less scholarly attention has been paid to the Rosewood Race Massacre. The image that you see at the top is one of three photos of the aftermath of Rosewood. And then this memorial down here, this signage is meant to convey, to talk about the massacre, to talk about the community that was destroyed during the massacre. However, it's the most damaged sign out of any other sign in the entire state of Florida, and it is in constant need of being remade or repaired. And oftentimes people drive by it and shoot at it, or it's even been ripped out of the ground. Um, so it's a sign that's endured a lot. And so, what each of these communities and these massacres have in common, even though they're vastly different, right? What they have in common is that they're multiracial, although they are coded as Black, and we understand them to be Black, right? In the past and in the present. And the justification of the violence was predicated on allegations of sexual assault by white women against Black men, and that the crime, vice, and poverty that coded these communities as Black were key reasons for their destruction. So, GIS. I use this Black geography's methodology as the framework through which Black placekeeping is situated by emphasizing the diverse sociopolitical and spatial relationships between Black people, the materiality of racial violence in the landscape. So, to locate the materialities of racial violence, I participated in uh, the Springfield Massacre walking tour and the Tulsa Race Massacre walking tour. And this allowed visitors to kind of walk the footsteps of the mob. And during this walk, uh, and during this, I walked primarily in Tulsa and Springfield. In Rosewood, I drove just because it's rural and it's hard to kind of it's harder to get around. Um, but I walked around in the other two locations, and I used the tourist guides and brochures from Springfield and Tulsa to kind of get around, which you could see at the top corner. In Springfield and Tulsa, this location was in the downtown or central district because that's kind of where the massacres sort of took place and materialized. And so as I made my way around these massacres, I made sure to locate other materialities of racial violence that were not as visible or intentionally placed on the landscape. This was important to my approach because it is oftentimes difficult to know how the landscape has been changed and to capture what is no longer there. And so it was at each location that I took the coordinates from each type of materiality and created the materiality of racial violence landscape, I'm sorry, spreadsheet, inserted into GIS, right? And then like what you see here. So what did I find? So in Springfield, we see like an abundance of memorialization. Um, the archives are very much relegated to the like Lincoln Presidential Library. It has the biggest repository of the archives related to the massacre. Like I said, the archaeology it produced an abundance of material culture, but as you see the little blue dot at the top, that's where the Badlands District is. And then the question becomes though, like, it becomes important to then assess like, although we're dealing with communities that where archaeology has taken place, there's a question to ask about like what are communities, how accessible is this material, right? We can ask that question when we're talking about the archaeology. We can also ask that question when we're talking about the archives, and I want y'all to remember that. Yep. In Tulsa, you see once again this abundance of memorialization. The archives, you see a few more archival repositories. And this is just what was found, right? Like there are also larger questions around what do people have in their homes? Like what do people have in their basements, right? Like I'm sure there's so many more like archival materials that speak to the race massacre, but this is just like what is on the landscape, right? And then the archaeology you see here, this dot that's way down to the south, what is that? Oh, that's one of the locations that was associated with the mass graves investigation. Um, and then the one at the top is part of our project, a mapping historical trauma project. And then the one kind of the dark blue dot that's in the middle, that is Oak Lawn. And in Florida, you see significantly less than the other two, right? Um, you see some memorialization happening in Miami or close to Miami and Gainesville, which it's important to note that Miami is a place where a lot of survivors fled. They fled down to Miami or they fled out of the state. Uh, and then there are archives in Tallahassee, and that archive, that sort of lonely yellow spot in the middle, that's where the county seat is. And so there's a quite a large repository there as well. And the archaeology, as we see that little red dot that is in Rosewood. where the archaeology was conducted in 2020, in 2013. Okay, so like what does all of this tell us and what does it mean? It means that there is a oversaturation of memorialization within these communities and like why, right? Part of the reason could be that archaeology is hard to organize. It can be hard to organize. It's expensive and it takes quite a bit of investment. You know, it requires permits, all of those other sorts of things. And archival materials are hard to locate for the very same reason that, you know, people have things in their basements and in their closets and things like that. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that there's quite a bit of shame that oftentimes goes along with these events. Uh, the most memorialization is happening in urban context, and it's easy to kind of produce um, and create like the visibility, right? That I think maybe the state, maybe the city or the town wants to. And we can ask ourselves, what does that communicate to visitors? What are they trying to communicate about themselves and their values to visitors in these towns and cities? Formalized memorials do more to create a tourist hub. And, you know, it's evident in Springfield and Tulsa. And in Springfield and Tulsa, the materials are located in or are in or are in close proximity to the historic districts. That's more so in Tulsa, but definitely the case in Springfield. And it's not really the case at all in Rosewood, except for that one sign that's constantly destroyed. And this just shows the level of violence is a major influence, but not the sole determinant of permanent displacement, which is why it is necessary to look more at more contemporary forms of landscape violence. The rural nature of rosewood can be seen as a justification for the scattered nature of the material. I would argue that the scattered nature of material also the result of the massacre being more successful there. I wouldn't say it was successful because whenever you go now to what was historic Rosewood, it's it's almost like an encampment. It's quite interesting. It's a bunch of homes and they have a few of them have like pretty high walls built around them, a lot of Trump flags, a lot of things like that. And it's very and the community, the land looks nothing like it did in the past, right? But I do want to say that there's no such thing as Black communities, particularly in this context, as being totally erased. And even though Springfield and Tulsa have significant amounts of access to the materiality of racial violence, and therefore, I argued right at the beginning of this that they should have more of a capacity for placekeeping. How do we contend with the fact that Rosewood descendants come from different parts of the state and country for this family reunion, which we see at the bottom here, right? And it just shows that regardless of the community's access to materiality, which Rosewood has virtually none, um, placekeeping is still happening there. You see descendants, this sort of intergenerational, and very moving ceremony that's happening here. And so placekeeping is able to take place not only due to these materials, but it's in oral narratives and memories being passed down from generation to generation that placekeeping is able to happen. And so then, like, why does this matter, right? Like, why is this research important? And in short, this project seeks to articulate a Black struggle that emphasizes the spatial and material components of being Black in an anti-Black world. And I show how there's a link between Black people's spatial and temporal relationships and how that is negotiated on the landscape. And I address the inherent problems of being labeled placeless by default, which only further marginalizes. Um, how Black people are situated in the material world and the perception of placelessness. And liberation, I think one of the most important things is that liberation is part of this ongoing and ever-evolving process that is unsettled, unfixed, and unresolved. And although this might seem a bit like scary or demoralizing, it creates the opportunity for infinite possibilities when seeking to understand Black people, how Black people engage with the world. And so, therefore, by engaging with the materialities of racial violence, on the outset, that can be seen, and even in the very name, right? Like it could be seen as like centering what has been done to Black people. However, I aim to shift this narrative by elevating how Black people engage with these materials and how their literal existence can drive this sort of like cultural potency that speaks not only to violence, but also these like larger aspirations of Black liberation. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and Kim. That was a very interesting presentation, and I greatly appreciate it. I think we can open it up for questions now.